It looks like we are ready to proceed with tonight's presentation. So welcome, good evening. Welcome to the Middle East and Islamic Studies event tonight, the Rashid Khalidi book talk on the 100 Years War on Palestine. My name is Brad Bowman, and I am the director of our Middle East and Islamic Studies program here at U of L, and I'm also in the Department of History. I must say that I'm incredibly excited and pleased that we were able to bring such an event to you by Zoom. But before I begin the introduction, which is really sort of my task tonight, is to introduce our speaker. Before I do that, I have to say a few words of thanks to people that made this possible tonight. So in terms of local organizations, I would like to thank the Jewish Voice for Peace, the Louisville Committee for Peace in the Middle East, and the Fellowship of Reconciliation for their sponsorship and all of their support in making tonight's presentation possible. I would also like to single out a few individuals that have been instrumental in making this event a reality for us here at Middle East and Islamic Studies. That is, begins really with Dr. Ian Muchnick and Mazen El-Masri, two friends from the community here in Louisville that originally came to us with a proposal to have such a talk, and they have supported us every step of the way. So a great thanks go out to both of those gentlemen. As well, I would like to mention Asma Adarad Edwards, our Director of Development in Arts and Sciences, who has really put a great deal of time and effort into organizing the event. Since this is a Zoom webinar, of course, none of it would have been possible without the help of Brandon Harwood from our Commonwealth Center for Humanities and Society at U of L, and also our very own history department's Chad White. So thank you guys so much for all of the tech savvy that you guys have shown. So it is much appreciated. Additionally, the latter portion of tonight's event will be a Q&A session that will be moderated by Dr. Russell Vandenbroek from our Peace, Justice, and Conflict Transformation Program. So a note of thanks to Russell also. Those attending the Zoom can access the Q&A function for the end of the talk. And lastly, let me just say a quick word of thanks to Julie Petit, the developer of our program, Middle East and Islamic Studies here at U of L, and our longtime director who continues to guide us and support the program going forward. So thank you, Julie. So I know the event that everybody is waiting for. Let me introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. Rashid Khalidi, the Edward Said Professor of Modern Arab Studies at Columbia University. Professor Khalidi is the author of several books and many articles, books such as Brokers of Deceit, The Iron Cage, Palestinian Identity, and Resurrecting Empire, all of which are award-winning books. Tonight, Dr. Khalidi will be discussing his most recent project, The 100 Years War on Palestine. And in closing, for my part at least, I would just like to let everybody know, we were actually chatting about this earlier, but in our Chow auditorium on campus, I'm actually above the Chow right now in a study room just because of the reverb that would happen if I tried to introduce it there. But there is a collection of people on campus in the Chow watching as a community. And so this event just really has a nice feel to it. And it's been exceedingly popular and people are really talking about it on campus, off campus in the larger community. So this is a very enthusiastic crowd that we've got in the Chow tonight. So with that, I give a most sincere thanks, most of all, of course, to Dr. Khalidi for giving us his expertise and his time this evening. So Rashid, I will quickly just turn it over to you and I will get off the Zoom now and just go down to the Chow and listen. So thank you so much, Rashid, for everything. I really appreciate you doing it for us.
Well, thank you very much, Brad. Thanks to everybody who was involved in organizing this event. I really do appreciate the opportunities that I've gotten from University of Louisville and many other venues to talk about this book. I've actually been very, very surprised by the response to this book. It's the 8th book that I've written. And I have never had a response to anything I've written like what I have enjoyed with this book. It came out in January, at the very end of January 2020. And I had a book tour planned, which was aborted, which was cut short by the beginning of the pandemic in March. And I thought the book would never sell. Nobody would read it. It was all over. And I just chalked it up as an unfortunate experience. And then I started getting requests for book talks, and I've done about 50 of them. And I'm still getting requests for book talks. The book has now been out for, over 18 months, over 20 months. And I'm very, very flattered and pleased and honored that so many people are interested in it, even now. I think that speaks to a moment that we're in as regards Palestine, as regards Palestine and Israel, as regards people's ability to pay attention to something that's hard and sensitive. And I'm flattered and I'm honored. And thank you very, very much, all of you, for bringing me to Louisville in this strange online fashion. I'm going to talk about 6 things this evening, briefly. I'll talk about how I came to write this book. I'll talk about how it differs from the other books I've written, the other 7 books that I've written and published since 1980, I think. It was the first one. I will talk about why I chose this specific title, The 100 Years' War on Palestine, and why I chose the specific subtitle, A History of Settler Colonialism and Resistance, 1917 to 2017. Thirdly, I'll delve into this, the reasons for each of those terms. The next thing that I'll do, the 5th thing that I'll do, will be to talk about the structure of the book. And I won't go chapter by chapter through the entire book. I'll talk maybe about the first couple, maybe the first 2 or 3, or possibly 4 of the 6 chapters, and explain how I organized my treatment of this 100 Years' War on Palestine. And finally, I'll speak a little bit about what everybody wants to know about, is what do you think is a possible solution? I obviously don't have an answer to that question, but I'll give you the principles that I think should form the basis of any solution that would purport to be sustainable and lasting and just and so forth. So let me start by talking about how I came to write this book. Of the books that I have written, at least 3 are devoted specifically to Palestinian history. I've written books on British policy. I've written books on the American Middle East policy. I've written books on Arab nationalism. But of the others, at least 3 focus on aspects of Palestinian history. And so, it's a reasonable question. Why did you write another one on this book? And the reason I did this was essentially because my son, who is a playwright, my son Smaid, who is a playwright and someone who writes for broad audiences, essentially said to me that I had to write something like this, that it was time for me to write a book that was not for academics, was not intended for Ph.D. students or other historians. It was time for me to write a book that was relatable. It was time for me to write a book that was accessible to readers who were interested in the topic, but were not necessarily specialists or experts. And he wouldn't let up on this. Another cousin of mine was after me from another angle, saying, you've got to write a general history of Palestine. But my son was actually instrumental in directing me to do it in a specific way. And to talk about the kind of things that he said I would talk about when discussing my own family and my own personal experiences, or that his mother and I would talk about in talking about our personal experiences, whether in Beirut, where we lived for many, many years, where all of my children were born during the war, the lengthy civil/regional war that was fought in and over Lebanon. And other experiences that I've had. He said, you've got to bring that stuff in. You've got to talk about those things. And you've got to do it in a way that is, not boring, basically, he said, not meant for a bunch of other specialists and academics. So that explains how this book differs from everything I've ever written. All of the over 100 academic articles I've written, all of the other books I've written, all of the books I've edited several volumes of articles by and chapters by other authors. All of them are written within the conventions of the historical profession. All of them were written in the third person. all of them were written in the way that I had been taught to write as a budding historian, starting as an undergraduate and then as a graduate student. And that was a mode that I was comfortable with. In fact, it was the only mode I was comfortable with. I wrote op-eds, I wrote other kinds of things, but most of my writing, all of the books, all of the edited volumes, all of the academic articles were written within that convention of the historical profession. And through the influence, especially of my son, but I have to say also of my editor at Metropolitan Books, Riva Hacherman, who's a very experienced, very talented editor. I wrote this in an entirely different voice and using an entirely different mode and an entirely different approach to anything I'd ever done. And I have to say, it was the hardest writing I ever did, because I was breaking with 40 odd years of training, more than 40 years, well over 40 years of training, in order to write this book in this way. It is full, it's first of all, in many places written in the first person. It's full of personal material. It's full of family material, my own family and other families, my wife's family, for example. My wife's grandfather is a figure in this book. Many of the members of my family, my grandfather, my grandmother, several of my aunts, one of my uncles in particular, some of my cousins, other people in my family, and earlier members of the family. People who were cousins of my grandfather, who played some kind of role in the history of Palestine, or who wrote down things about their experiences that I thought were germane, relevant, and made this story much more accessible. So the book is written in a personal fashion. It involves a lot of my own observations, things that I saw, things that I was told. It includes a great deal of material about my own family, some members of which played prominent roles and some members of which are unknown, like my father. My father worked at the United Nations for his whole career. And he worked in what was then called the Political and Security Council Affairs Division of the United Nations, which meant he was in the Security Council chamber every time the Middle East was discussed, from sometime in the 50s until the end of the 1960s. And I heard that about what was going on there at the dinner table, and I sometimes was in the visitors gallery in the Security Council. So there's stuff that I saw, stuff that I was told, and material from other people's memoirs. Now, this is not an autobiography by any means. It's not a family history by any means. It includes material from many other families, not just my own. So material from my family plays a big part in the book. And it's not just a string of anecdotes. There are 45 pages of footnotes for those who want to delve into the sources that I use for this, or want to see why I say what I say. Where does he get that from? That's all there. But I meant this book to be read by a general audience, by a non-expert audience. I meant it to be read without the 45 pages of footnotes, if you choose to do it that way. I mean, it's a narrative, it's a story. It's organized into 6 chapters, each of which is sort of a self-contained declaration of war on the Palestinians. That's the convention that I used. And I'll talk about that later when I talk about the structure of the book. And my hope is that you can listen to it as an audible book, as an audio book, or you can read it without necessarily having to go to the footnotes. There are a lot of discoveries that I made along the way that I do include in the text and which are laid out in terms of sources in the footnotes. So if you're interested, for example, in the Sabra and Shatila massacres in 1982, if you're interested in Israel and the United States collective decision for Israel to go to war in 1982, there are revelations there, either from work done by my students or newly revealed material or previously unpublished material, which are discussed in the book. And then you can see the sources and you can go to them yourself. So that is how this book differs from everything I've ever written as an academic. All of the articles and scholarly journals and all of the other books. And I hope I hope that it's accessible to people. Unlike most other books that I've published, it has had it is having or is going to have a wide circulation abroad. There are 12 foreign editions that are either coming out or have come out in different parts of the world in different languages. And I think that's maybe a sign that the publishers, who presumably are only going to buy rights to a book if they think it will sell, also feel that this is a book that's relatable. This is a book that a non-expert general audience can read. So that's how I came to write the book, and that's how it differs from everything else I've written. Let me now plunge into the book itself and talk a little bit first about the title and then a little bit about the subtitle. Why did I call this book The 100 Years' War on Palestine? Why didn't I say, for example, The 100 Years' War in Palestine? That would imply that, like the original 100 Years' War in France, it was between Britain and France, or rather the King of England and the King of France. In fact, it wasn't between the British people. There was no such thing. Or the French people. There was no such thing. There were people who spoke French, but the people who fought for the French king and the people who fought for the English king, most of them spoke French. The Anglo-Norman aristocracy was French speaking. So this was not a war between nations or between peoples. But my book is not about the 100 Years' War. And I don't use the title, the 100 Years' War in Palestine, because I'm arguing in this book for a reframing of our understanding of what was going on and what has been going on in Palestine over the past 100+ years. It is, I'm trying to argue, not solely a war between two national movements, though that's part of it. It's not solely a war between what have become two peoples. It is a war which is not in any way symmetrical or equally balanced. It is a war in which there's a huge imbalance in the forces involved. They are not two equal parties, quite the contrary. One of the features of this war is that both sides see themselves as victims. Both sides see themselves as underdogs, but that in fact is not the case. They are not both underdogs. In fact, there is and has always been quite a significant imbalance of power. This has to do not just with the strength or weakness of the Zionist movement and later the State of Israel, of the Palestinians and their various allies. It has to do with the fact that this is not just a struggle between Palestinians and Zionism or between Palestinians and the State of Israel. This is and has always been a struggle involving the greatest powers of that age, whether the period in which the conflict really begins, which is to say the end of the 19th, the beginning of the 20th century, when Great Britain from 1917 becomes a major actor, and in some periods the major actor in Palestine. So the war is not necessarily declared by the Zionist movement. It's in fact declared, as I'm going to argue, by the British. And the British are the primary wagers of that war on the Palestinians in that period, in that early period of the first couple of decades after 1917. So I think that's a second reason that I argue that it has to be understood as a war on Palestine and on the Palestinians, because it's not just a conflict between Zionism and Palestinians or Israel and the Palestinians. It is a conflict involving first Britain up to the 1940s, then the United States and the Soviet Union on the side of Israel, then Britain and France again on the side of Israel, and later on from 67 onwards, or even before 67 onwards, the United States and Israel. And those are the parties in the field. The guns are from those countries. Israel wins the 48 war with Soviet, Czech, and American arms. Israel wins the 56 war and the 67 war with British and French arms. They are there. They're not there as soldiers. They're not there as actual direct combatants, but they are directly involved, both in the framing of the conflict, in the way in which the conflict is understood and attempts are made to resolve it, but also in putting their very large thumbs on the scale in favor of one side. And that has always been the case. The Zionist movement was never alone in the field. Israel was never alone in the field against an array of Arabs. It always had the backing, really from the 1917 date that I chose for the beginning of this narrative, right up to the present. And so that is another reason for calling this a war on Palestine, because the 67 war is not just Israel. The 67 war, obviously Israel fights it alone, but Israel goes to this war after Israel sends an envoy to Washington in 1967. It fights the 82 war after the Israeli war minister, Ariel Sharon, goes to Washington. And in every case gets a green light, gets military support, gets diplomatic support, gets assent to Israel's war aims. So I see this as much more than just an Arab Israeli or a Palestinian Israeli or an Arab Zionist conflict. It is all of those things at different phases, but it is also always, in my view, a war in which these external powers are parties. They're not neutral. The British constantly tried to talk about their role in balancing between the Arabs and the Jews. Nonsense, absolute and utter nonsense. If you don't believe that, read the book, and I can suggest other books you can read to show how very partisan the British were from the very beginning in their framing of what they were doing, in the mandate that they wrote for themselves, and on the basis of which they ruled Palestine, and right up to the 1940s when they changed their position, and the Zionist movement managed to find other backers in the United States and the Soviet Union. So that's the title, The 100 Years' War on Palestine. How about the subtitle? A History of Settler Colonialism and Resistance. I argue in this book that what is at stake when we want to understand what is happening in Palestine is not just the creation of a Jewish state. That's what Herzl laid out in his aspirations in a book called The Jewish State. This is what the first Zionist Congress was about, starting in 1897 in Basel. This is what the Zionist movement always was directed at, a Jewish state in Palestine. But it's not just about that. It's not just about the idea that the Jews are a people in the modern national sense. It's not just about the ideas that are fundamental to Zionism. It's not just about the idea of rescue of persecuted Jewish populations living in conditions of persecution, and ultimately under Hitler during the Holocaust, attempted destruction of the entirety of European Jewry. It is not just those things. It is also in the understanding of all the early Zionists, of Herzl himself, of Ben-Gurion, of Zev Jabotinsky, the founders of various trends in political Zionism from the late 1890s right up through the 30s. It is also a process, not just of reestablishing or establishing a Jewish state in the historic land of Israel, but also a process of settlement and colonization. These are not derogatory terms in the parlance of the people who themselves were doing these things. One of the major agencies that was involved in the purchase and in the distribution of land in Palestine for the Zionist movement was called the Jewish Colonization Agency. Colonization is not a smear. It's not an anti-Semitic insult to the Zionist movement. It's what those generations of early Zionists considered themselves to be doing. They were colonizing as Europeans. They were settling their ancestral homeland. And they understood that there was an indigenous people. And I'm going to share something which relates to both this idea of settler colonialism and the other part of the subtitle, which is resistance. Obviously, any colonial power will engender resistance from the population it's colonizing, whether Britain and India, or a regular colonial power, or a settler colonial power like Britain in North America. And obviously that resistance is going to take various forms. And obviously that resistance is going to be coded by that colonial power in derogatory terms, whether, as the British used to say, banditry or savagery, or as Israel has more recently taken to saying, terrorism. But I go back to an understanding of it as resistance, not just because that is the way in which colonial conflicts are always, have to, I think, always be understood. But also because that's, I think, how early Zionists themselves understood it. And I'm sharing the screen here to show you a document in which I bring together a number of quotes from an important Zionist leader by the name of Zev Jabotinsky. His original name was Vladimir. He changed it to Zev. And he wrote in an article entitled The Iron Wall in 1923, and I'm just going to read it to you. Every native population in the world resists colonists as long as it has the slightest hope of being able to rid itself of the danger of being colonized. That is what the Arabs in Palestine are doing, and what they will persist in doing as long as there remains a solitary spark of hope that they will be able to prevent the transformation of, quote, Palestine into the, quote, land of Israel. I think that this sums up a number of things that I think we have to understand. Jabotinsky and early Zionists understood that the Palestinians, the Arabs whom they found when they arrived as immigrants and as settlers, were the native population. They understood that they themselves were colonizing a country which they claimed, which they believed was their historic right, whether they believed it in biblical terms or in other terms. But they understood that they were engaged in a colonizing process. And they understood that that population would resist. They, as Jabotinsky say, that's what the Arabs in Palestine are doing. And finally, he makes it very clear what the objective of the Zionist project is. The objective of the Zionist project was not for Jews to come to Palestine and live as a minority in yet another country. Anybody who says that knows nothing about Zionism. The idea is a Jewish state, a state with a Jewish majority, which in a country that has an overwhelming Arab majority means you're going to transform the country. And you're going to transform that country one way or another by changing that population balance. So you are transforming Palestine, as he says, into the land of Israel. And that is, in my view, the clearest and most honest statement of what the Zionist project is and always was. He goes on and says, in another quote from the same article, Zionist colonization, and I've omitted a long passage here, can proceed and develop only under the protection of a power that is independent of the native population behind an iron wall which the native population cannot breach. He says somewhere else, if you wish to colonize a land in which people are already living, you must find a garrison for the land, or find a benefactor who will provide a garrison on your behalf. Zionism is a colonizing venture, and therefore it stands or falls on the question of armed forces. Now, when I've given this talk and I'm going to stop sharing right here, so you can see me again. I've been criticized for not including what labor Zionists, who were the dominant trend in Zionism until relatively recently, until the 1970s, actually, when the heirs of Zev Jabotinsky, Menachem Begin and Yitzhak Shamir took over the Israeli governments. And that is the trend under the Herut party, later under the Likud party, which has essentially dominated Israeli politics for the last 45 years or so. But I've been challenged by people who say, why don't you quote Ben-Gurion? Well, if I were to quote Ben-Gurion, I would quote his diaries rather than his public statements, because his public statements were entirely disingenuous. He never was as honest as Jabotinsky was in saying, of course, we'll have to fight them. We have to be stronger than them. We're going to have to beat them because, of course, they're going to resist. One of the most prominent tropes in the argumentation that the Zionist leaders in the 20s and the 30s, who knew better, used was the idea, oh, no, somehow we can figure this out. Overwhelming force, crushing the Palestinians won't be necessary. Jabotinsky had no such illusions. And he argued that others were either deceiving themselves or were purposely deceiving others. And I bring this up because I think it indicates a number of enduring features of this struggle between what have become two peoples through the development of Zionism and the development of the state of Israel and of the Israeli people, the Jewish people of Israel in particular, and of the Palestinian people in the last many decades. And this is a conflict between a colonial settler project and an indigenous native population. That is what it is. The fact that those settlers have a claim, a religious claim to this homeland is undeniable, but is irrelevant in terms of understanding what is actually going on the ground. This is a colonial settler conflict like many others. It's different in many respects. The Zionist movement is not like French colonialism in Algeria, where a French population based in the metropole comes to take over a country from its indigenous population. It's not like South Africa. It's not like any other colonial settler project. The United States starts as a British colonial project. Quebec starts as a French colonial project. And in every one of those cases, the settlers are extensions of the mother country. That's not true with Zionism. Zionism is an independent project which has a national ambition. The settlers who come to North America come as projections of the metropole, and they want the metropole to do what they need to protect them against the native population so they can settle and take over the land of that population. Israel is in a similar position in that it needs the support of a metropole, or the Zionist project, later the State of Israel, but it is an independent actor, always independently financed, independently run, with its own leadership and with its own national ambitions. So while it has similarities to other settler colonial projects, it's completely different. It also has a biblical justification. It sees itself as having a title to this land, or at least those who believe, who are religious among the Zionist leadership, most of them were somewhat religious, believe this as well. It's summed up in the theme song of the movie Exodus, an execrable movie. This land is our land. God gave this land to us. That sums up the idea which many evangelical Christians and many other believers in Christianity and Judaism take from the Bible, whether the Hebrew Bible or the New Testament. So this is my reasoning for why I use what I think is I intended to be a provocative title, The 100 Years' War on Palestine, and the provocative subtitle, A History of Settler Colonialism and Resistance, between those two dates, 1917 and 2017. Let me talk now a little bit about the structure of the book. I structured this book in terms of what I call 6 declarations of war. So the first of them is the Balfour Declaration. I described the Balfour Declaration issued by Britain on November 2nd, 1917, and the mandate for Palestine, which Britain gets from the League of Nations a few years later, and which is based on and includes the text of the Balfour Declaration, as a declaration of war on the Palestinian people by Britain and by the League of Nations. And I'll describe why I see that, and I'll go into a little detail in discussing that first chapter. The second chapter talks about what I call the second declaration of war. The second declaration of war has to do with the Partition Resolution adopted by the UN General Assembly on November 29th, 1947, whereby the United Nations called for the partition of Palestine into a Jewish state in most of the country, over 55% of the country, and an Arab state in about 45, a little less than 45% of the country, and an internationalized so-called corpus separatum in and around Jerusalem with economic union between these two states. Why do I describe it as such? Well, firstly, this is not a resolution which, let me put it differently. This is a resolution that is adopted essentially because the United States and the Soviet Union wanted it to be adopted. It's adopted, secondly, in a way that's massively favorable to the Zionist movement. At that moment, the Jewish population of Palestine was under a third of the total. Arabs made up 2/3 of the population of the country. The country was predominantly Arab. Most land was still owned by Arabs. 6% of the land of Palestine was owned by the Jewish Colonization Agency, Keren Kayemet, the Jewish National Fund, and various other colonization agencies of the Zionist movement. Most of the land was owned by Palestinians, even in 1947. So a country which is predominantly Arab, which has an overwhelming Arab majority, and which has, and most of the land is owned by the Arab population of Palestine, is partitioned with most of it given to the Jewish minority. And so I argue in the second chapter that this is another declaration of war on the Palestinians. Most of their country is being given to a minority, which is intending to, as Jabotinsky said, transform the land of Palestine into the land of Israel, which the Zionist project ultimately does. The state of Israel ultimately does. That's the situation today. Palestine has been transformed into the land of Israel. The entirety of it, from the river to the sea, is controlled by one sovereign state, the state of Israel. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. The third declaration of war involves 1967, and it has to do both with the American involvement and support for Israel's attack on the Arab states at the time of this confrontation between the Arab states and Israel in May and early June of 1967, when it looked like there would be a war between the two. Israel launches a preemptive attack on the Arab states, claiming that they were about to attack it. The United States supports this, gives a green light for this. And in this chapter, I talk both about that, and more importantly, I talk about Security Council Resolution 242 and why I see this as a declaration of war on the Palestinians. I may not have time to go into that in detail, but I can talk about that later on in Q&A. There's a fourth declaration of war, which is the 1982 war. And I see the 1982 war, which involved an Israeli invasion of Lebanon with three objectives: to drive the PLO out, to defeat the Palestinians' Lebanese allies in the Lebanese national movement, and to create a friendly puppet regime, which will sign a peace treaty with Israel, which in fact they did do. They created such a regime, and that regime did sign a peace treaty with Israel. It never went into force. And finally, to expel Syrian influence from Lebanon. This is not just an Israeli war aim. This is not just what Begin and Sharon are cooking up. This is run by the United States. Sharon comes to Washington in May of 1982, and he lays the whole plan out before Secretary of State Haig. And Haig gives a green light to it. So it's an American-Israeli declaration of war on the PLO, on the Lebanese national movement, and on the Syrian presence in Lebanon. The fifth declaration of war deals with the period from the First Intifada, 1987, up through the signing of the Oslo Accords. If I have time, I'll go into that. And the sixth has to do with the various wars on Gaza, the siege of Gaza and the wars on Gaza that have been waged since the year 2000. I certainly won't have time to get into the last couple of chapters, but if there are any questions, I'd be happy to talk about them. Let me go back and talk about the first declaration of war, which is to say the Balfour Declaration, because I think this sets the tone for so much of what follows. I argue that this is not a conflict that has been going on since time immemorial. I don't argue it. It is a fact. There was no Jewish-Arab conflict in Palestine in 1817, in 1717, in 1617, in 1517. You can go back century by century, right back to the Crusades, when you did have a conflict between Christian crusading powers and between the local Muslim powers. It wasn't between Arabs and Jews. In fact, Jews were being massacred along with Muslims, and in fact also Arab Christians, when the Crusaders take Jerusalem in 1099. So you do not have a conflict between first of all, you don't have a Zionist movement, and you don't have Palestinian nationalism in 1717 or 1617 or any century before that, going back to time immemorial. In fact, what you have are a variety of conflicts in Palestine between various actors, but not between the ones who have been in conflict ever since 1917. So that's why I start this narrative with 1917 and with the Balfour Declaration, because it's that point that it takes on the characteristic which I say is what identifies it and what makes it distinct. It's not just Jews and Arabs or Zionists and Palestinians or Israel and the Palestinians. It is that plus enormously powerful external actors on the side, first of the Zionist movement and later on the side of Israel. And I listed what those powers were: Britain, later United States and the Soviet Union, later Britain and France, and ever since the 60s, the United States. So let me bring up this document and share it with you. And this document is the Balfour Declaration. This is the entire text of the Balfour Declaration. It has essentially one operative paragraph, which is one sentence. The Balfour Declaration is a letter given to Lord Rothschild, representing the Zionist movement in Britain, by Lord Balfour, who at that time is the Foreign Secretary, Britain's Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs. And the operative paragraph is right in front of you. His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. So this is a statement meant to be made public, issued on behalf of the entire British cabinet. So it represents a British government decision, represents the policy of that government, this was the Lloyd George government in 1917. And it's issued to the Zionist movement in Britain at their request, and as a result of a lengthy negotiation that goes back to the beginning of the Lloyd George government in 1916. More than a year of negotiations are involved in producing this one sentence, which is tinkered with and edited and chopped up and rewritten endlessly in the year and more of negotiation over it. And I have highlighted a couple of terms which I think are extraordinarily important. the British government was saying three or four things with this declaration. Firstly, that it saw that the Jews were a people. There is a Jewish people. They have, therefore, national rights. They have the right to a national home. The term nation state, the term self-determination is not there, but it's that understanding that lies behind the terms a national home for the Jewish people. And these are extremely important. This declaration is then incorporated verbatim into the Mandate for Palestine, under which Britain rules that country from 1922. Well, it's in control already in 1917, but from 1922 until Britain leaves in 1948, on May 15th, 1948, when the last British troops leave Palestine. The second term that's extremely important is the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. Now, you have to understand something. Palestine was not an empty country at the time. It had 750,000 people, of whom 95%, 94%, perhaps 93% were not Jewish. They were Muslim or they were Christian, they were Arab. And they are essentially elided as a national group in this declaration. The word Palestinians, the word Arabs doesn't exist. The idea that that group, which forms the overwhelming majority of the population of Palestine at the time, and right up until 1948 for that matter, do not constitute a people and are not entitled to a national home in their country, is central to this declaration. It's what this declaration is about. It is saying there is one people in Palestine. There's one group with national rights in Palestine. And the others, the overwhelming majority, are entitled not to national rights, not to political rights, but to civil and religious rights. And they're never named. This is one of the extraordinarily important features, not just of the Balfour Declaration and not just of the Mandate for Palestine, but of British rule over Palestine, certainly for its first couple of decades. And I think this is extraordinarily important because one of the things that this is doing is to say we are a power that has the right to make this decision about a country which is not yet under even our control fully. British troops didn't take Jerusalem until a little later in the year, a little later in 1917, I think in December. Allenby's forces reach Jerusalem and capture the city. And they don't take northern Palestine until well into 1918. Nevertheless, Britain has decided that it has the right to dispose of this country by helping to establish a national home for the Jewish people. And it has the right to decide who is a national group in Palestine. The Jewish people are the only ones described here, and who has much, much less significant rights. They don't have national rights. They don't have political rights. They're not entitled to be named. And all they have, as the declaration says, are civil and religious rights. This is a trope, and this is an approach which is reiterated again and again in the way in which the issue of Palestine and the issue of how to deal with Palestine is repeated throughout the following 100 years. The Palestinians are not consulted. The United States is about to open, or has suggested it's going to open a consulate or reopen a consulate in Jerusalem. Who's making a decision on this? The Israeli government and the US government. The Palestinians are not consulted. It's a consulate which is supposed to deal with them. Are the Palestinians invited to debate this, discuss this? They're not. And if you look at the history of the British Mandate over Palestine, the Palestinians are never treated as if they have a right to sit at the table. They're never allowed, for example, to address the Permanent Mandate Commission of the League of Nations, whereas what becomes the Jewish Agency, which is developed on the basis of the Mandate for Palestine, has a right under the mandate to come and speak with diplomatic. It has, in other words, it has a diplomatic right to speak. The Palestinians are never given this during the mandate. Eventually, there are negotiations involving them, but they're always seen as on a subordinate level to that of the Zionist movement. And this is the case as late as Security Council Resolution 242, which never mentions the Palestinians. The word Palestinian, the word Palestine doesn't occur in Security Council Resolution 242 of 1967. I would talk more about the various other declarations of war. I'll say a little bit, perhaps, about the Declaration of War in 1947, about the Partition Resolution. I've already said something. But again, I think this is always misunderstood in many respects. People say, well, why didn't the Palestinians accept partition? Well, they didn't accept partition, firstly, because they understood under the covenant of the League of Nations that they were supposed to be an independent nation. Article 22 of the covenant describes the Arab portions that were formerly part of the Ottoman Empire as independent nations. Secondly, they believed that that had been promised by Britain during World War I. Thirdly, they believed that the UN Charter, which talked about self-determination, mandated, or should have mandated, that they would be granted independence in the country in which they were a majority. And so the idea of partitioning it and giving most of it to this minority, which had national objectives, which included eventually turning the country into the land of Israel, was something that was inconceivable. In addition, as I lay out in my discussion in the first chapter, the first declaration of war, which Britain issues through the Balfour Declaration and through the mandate for Palestine, ultimately did lead to a war. It was a war waged by the British on the Palestinians from 1936 until 1939, in which the back of Palestinian resistance to British colonialism and to Zionism is broken in a campaign in which 100,000 British troops participate, in which 10% of the adult male Arab population of Palestine is killed, wounded, imprisoned, or exiled, in which all the arms that the British can seize are seized, in which Jewish auxiliaries are armed and trained and sent into the field to fight alongside the 100,000 troops and police that the British have brought to Palestine, in which the Palestinian leadership is entirely either arrested or exiled. My uncle, who was a member of that leadership, is sent to the Seychelles Islands for 2 years. He's then brought back to the St. James Palace Conference at the end of 1939. And when that conference is over, he's exiled yet again. And he's not allowed to return to Palestine for several more years. And that's the case with the entire Palestinian leadership. So when the Palestinians are faced with the Partition Resolution, they are largely leaderless. Their military capacities have been devastated by the British during the 3 years repression of the Great Revolt of 1936-39. And they see it as an enormous injustice to them. So the Palestinians don't accept partition. And even the Arab state that is called for under partition is never taken seriously by any major international actor. The United States and the Soviet Union, who bully and blackmail and arm twist their way into a majority in the General Assembly in 1947 in order to achieve a majority support for the Partition Resolution, had no particular interest in the creation of an Arab state. Their intention, both of them, the United States and the Soviet Union, was the creation of a Jewish state in Palestine. That's why the resolution gives most of the country, including a huge amount of land owned by Arabs and areas which have almost as many Arabs as Jews. The Jewish state under partition would have had a 48 or 47% Arab minority. So most of the Jewish state would have been inhabited by Arabs or owned by Arabs, and almost a half of the population would have been Arab. The intention of the United States and the Soviet Union was to create that Jewish state. They didn't really intend to create an Arab state. They made no provisions in the resolution or at any point afterwards to see to it that such a state was created. And in fact, from the moment the Partition Resolution is adopted, the much superior forces of the Zionist movement, which is outnumbered at the beginning, overwhelmingly outnumbered, and which at the beginning appears to be in a perilous situation, very quickly tips the balance. And from a fraught situation in the winter and spring of 47-48, by late spring, by April, the militias of the Zionist movement are overrunning towns and villages and ultimately cities. The city of Jaffa falls, the city of Haifa falls, that's to say the Arab parts of those mixed cities fall. The western suburbs of Jerusalem, which include the western areas of Jerusalem, which include a large Arab population, fall. Before the state of Israel is created, before the Arab armies enter, and as many as 300,000 Palestinians are forced to flee or flee in terror as a result of massacres, bombardments, and the fact that their national movement's resistance had basically been broken by the British 7 or 8 years before. And so I see the Partition Resolution as a declaration of war on the Palestinians because even the token Arab state that is mandated under the Partition Resolution is never comes into being. The people who actively strangle it in its cradle, Israel, Jordan, and the British, are seconded in effect by the United States and the Soviet Union, who don't really care about it. They want a Jewish state. That's what they're interested in, both for their own reasons. President Truman and Stalin, each for his own reasons, each for their own reasons, want that. And they don't want an Arab state. And there's no Arab state created, and never has been since then. So I see the Partition Resolution as a declaration of war on the Palestinians. And ever since then, as I argue in the later chapters, there have been further declarations of war, in many cases by great powers, not necessarily by Israel. And the active animus is not just an animus of Israel, which doesn't want to see the country transformed into Palestine or to share the country with the Palestinian national movement, but rather the animus comes from these great power patrons of the Zionist project and later of the state of Israel. I'm going to stop talking about structure, and I'm going to conclude, because I see we've gone over 3/4 of an hour. I'm not supposed to talk for that much more. I want to talk a little bit about solutions. And I don't have a template or a plan. I don't have any idea how we will move and when we will move from the current status quo, which is one entirely favorable to Israel and to the colonization project that is underway every day, every moment in the occupied West Bank and in occupied Arab East Jerusalem. I don't know how that balance of forces can be changed. I don't know how the weakness and disorganization of the Palestinian national movement can be remedied. I don't know how the United States can be changed from overwhelming support for Israel in almost every realm to a less biased and less, in my view, less destructive role. And I don't, you know, I can talk a little bit about the United States. I can talk a little bit about Palestinian politics and a little bit about Israel if you want a question in Q&A. But I will say that if this is going to be resolved, and I hope and think that eventually it will be, it will have to be involved on a basis which involves at least two things. One of them is a recognition of what has happened here. What has happened here is not a tragic struggle between two national movements. There are two nations now, there are two peoples, but it is a struggle that has taken place in the context of a colonial settler project. That is not a contradiction in terms. You can be talking about a national entity that is created in the context of a settler colonial project. We live in one in the United States of America. This is a settler colonial project, an eminently successful one, which has created a people, a nation state in the midst of a process of the dispossession of the native population, the indigenous population, the Native American population. Same thing happened in Canada, same thing happened in New Zealand, same thing happened in Australia. That same thing is happening, or is in the process of it. Palestine is undergoing the same process. It hasn't reached quite the same level of success as has happened here, or in Canada, or in Australia, or New Zealand. But the fact that this is a settler colonial state, what we live in, does not in any way contradict the fact that in the context of that settler colonial project, a new nation has been established, a people, the American people, which is made up of people who are either settlers or immigrants to this settler colony. And that's the case. That has to be understood as the dynamic at work. It doesn't necessarily mean anything necessarily in terms of consequences that flow from that. But if you don't start from that historical understanding, if you start from an understanding of, well, this is part of the victimization of the Jewish people throughout history, and they're being victimized by the Palestinians who are just anti-Semites, you will never come to a resolution of this conflict. If you start from the basis of, well, what's laid out in the Bible is essentially a land deed. This is title. This is it. Jewish people are the only ones who have rights here. End of discussion. You start from that basis, you cannot have a solution. You can have annihilation of the Palestinians or elimination of the Palestinians or exclusion of the Palestinians from political rights, but you cannot have a just and lasting, sustainable solution. So the first element has to be that we have to understand what's going on and what's been going on here and how long it's been going on. It has not been going on since the Bible was codified 2,000 several hundred years ago. It has not been going on since time immemorial. It's been going on since modern national movements developed and since European settler colonialism arrived in Palestine with the Zionist project and with the backing of the greatest powers of the day, ultimately Great Britain and later on other powers, as I've laid out. Secondly, a just and lasting and sustainable resolution has to involve some basic principles of justice and equity. You cannot have unequal rights in a solution that's just and lasting. Everybody has to enjoy the same rights. Now, that can be done in any number of ways. You can, and I'm talking about collective rights, including national rights. I'm talking about rights to property. I'm talking about civil rights. I'm talking about human rights. I'm talking about religious rights. I'm talking about all kinds of rights. But you have to accept, first of all, that what has now developed are two peoples. And secondly, that everybody, every citizen, every member of those two groups have to be treated on an equal basis. They have to be treated under law on an equal basis. That can be in a multi-state solution, a two-state solution, a one-state solution, a cantonal solution. There are many, many possible ways to constitutionally and legally embody that principle of equality and that principle of justice. But if you don't do that in whatever framework you lay out, it's not going to work. It's going to embody injustice, inequality, and resistance from the people who feel that they have not achieved equality and a just outcome. So that is my sense of the basis on which a solution has to be thought about, foreseen. How we get to that, admirable end, I really don't know. How we get out of the status quo, which is one of inequity, one of injustice, one of, frankly, the complete dominance of one group over another, is very hard to say. I know that it's not just a matter for Israelis and Palestinians. It's a matter for the region. It's a matter for the world. It's a matter, most importantly, given the current configuration of global power, for the United States. The United States is an actor. The United States is responsible for much of what happens. American weapons are the ones that are being used in most cases, many cases. American funding, not just the $3.8 billion that our government gives in military aid to Israel, but the hundreds of millions of dollars in tax-free donations from 501c3s that go to supporting the Israeli army, Friends of the Israel Defense Forces, the hundreds of millions of dollars that go to the funding of the settlement project, the pouring of concrete, the fencing off of Arab land, the theft of Arab land, the legal processes, which are the so-called legal processes, the legalization of theft by the Israeli state, is funded by Americans. Under American tax law, these are 501c3s, tax-deductible charities. That's American money that the rest of us are paying taxes on, our income. And these people who are funding these things are making tax-free charitable donations. That can be changed by a stroke of the pen. The Treasury Department can simply determine that Friends of the Israel Defense Forces is not a charitable organization. Our legislators can decide that American arms are not being used for self-defense. There are laws, there are a variety of laws which mandate that American weapons can only be used by foreign countries that purchase them for self-defense. We can find that the use of American weapons in certain circumstances does not entail self-defense. That can be done by the United States. And if it doesn't do it, we're not only violating the law and abusing the idea of tax-free donations and so on and so forth. We're not only funding what goes on there. We are a party. The United States is a party to this conflict. It has been since the 1960s. It has been since even before that, as other external actors were parties to the conflict. They were not just bystanders. They were not mediators or honest brokers, American diplomats and others in this. They were parties to the conflict. So the resolution of it requires, as I've said, understanding the nature of what is going on, what has been at root in this struggle, what are the dynamics of the struggle. I try and do that in this book. And it has to rest on a basis of justice and equality for everybody concerned. There are now two national groups there, Palestinians and Israelis. And that has to be recognized. And those rights have to be recognized. How you dovetail them, I leave that to the political scientists and the policymakers. But everybody has to enjoy equal rights in any solution which we would hope would be sustainable, which we would hope would be just, and which we would hope would be lasting. Thank you very much.
And thank you very much for that presentation. We have about a half an hour, and I see a number of questions that have been posted. I will read them to get a response. As someone who possesses a surname that's often mispronounced, I'm going to avoid that by only using first names. I hope I don't offend anyone. Gina asked, Dr. Khalidi, don't you think Jabotinsky's quote mirrors the fact that this movement is falsified and not in any terms right because he says it has to be backed by armed forces? Question mark. I mean, it's falsified from people within it.
I'm not entirely sure what the questioner is asking, but let me take a stab at it. If I understand the question correctly, as I say, I'm not sure I do. In fact, I think that Jabotinsky is notable because he's by far the frankest and most forthright and most honest, least deceptive, if you want, of the Zionist leaders. He was arguing against a trend, which was at that time the dominant trend in Zionism, labor Zionism, which argued that, you know, this will resolve itself one way or another. All we do is we build up the state and it'll figure itself out. Jabotinsky said, no, we have to face the facts. We have to face first the fact that there is a native people here that's going to resist, and their resistance is understandable and legitimate. Secondly, the only way to overcome that resistance is force. And building up that force is absolutely essential. And until we can do that, we have to be protected by what he calls an iron wall, in effect, an iron wall of British bayonets. And that is how things transpired right up through the end of the 1930s. The British waged the war that Britain declared with the Balfour Declaration. They did this at the behest of the Zionist movement. They also did it at the behest of British imperial and strategic aims. Britain did not occupy Palestine solely because it favored the Zionist movement. In fact, it occupied Palestine. My first book talks about why the British did this. They did this for strategic reasons that had nothing to do with Zionism. Britain wanted to control an area which protected the eastern frontiers of Egypt and the Suez Canal. Britain wanted to control an area which was the connection point on the Mediterranean for the shortest land route between the Mediterranean and Europe and the Gulf, the Indian Ocean, and its Asian empire. Britain had strategic objectives in 1905, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, before they even began to negotiate the Balfour Declaration, before Chaim Weizmann had developed his friendships and his relationships with British cabinet ministers who come into the Lloyd George government in 1916. This is a decade before Britain had decided it needed to control Palestine. And I talk a little bit about this in other work that I've done. So Jabotinsky is saying here that we need them in order to protect us until we're ready to do the dirty work that has to be done. These people's resistance has to be overcome. And I think that if you look at Ben-Gurion's diaries, he understood this, but did he ever say this? No, no. There was a soft soap PR operation. And in that sense, it was entirely deceptive. I think that Jabotinsky was saying you're either deceiving yourselves or you're deceiving other people. I think the really clear-eyed leaders like Ben-Gurion were not deceiving themselves.
Thank you. Ali asks, can you relate the Palestinian displacement in 1948 to Palestinians' own false propaganda in exaggerating the threat of the settlers?
No, I can't. The flight, I've lived in a war zone. I lived in Beirut from the end of the 60s when my mother moved there. And I was a college student here until we left Beirut in 1983. We thought for a year, we ended up not able to return. So I lived in Beirut for 15 years. From 1973 onwards, there was war in Beirut. I was forced to move from my home twice. I moved to my mom's place at one stage of the war in 1975, and I moved back to our place at another stage of the war. In wartime, when people are under bombardment, the civilians leave, and they were being pushed to leave because there was an understanding on the part of the Zionist movement and a plan that you had to move the Arabs or you wouldn't have a Jewish state. It was not, you can't have a Jewish state in a majority Arab country unless you change that demographic balance. And so ethnic cleansing was the policy that was adopted. Eventually, it became a overt policy. In the case of Lid and Ramli, the army comes in, shoots at people, and tells them to leave. In other cases, when people don't leave, a massacre takes place. A massacre is carried out, and everybody is then forced to leave. In other cases, the bombardment of Jaffa or the bombardment of Haifa, the civilian population is under intense pressure. They're unable to resist, and they are forced to leave out of terror or because at gunpoint. So that is why you had 750,000 people leaving. It wasn't because their leaders told them to. That is a canard, that is a lie, that is false. They left out of either because they were terrorized into leaving or because they fled a war zone and because their own national movement wasn't able to protect them. That's why you had the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, and it was intentional. You would have had a Jewish state otherwise within the boundaries adopted under the partition plan, which would have had almost 600,000 Arabs and a little over 600,000 Jews. That's going to be obviously not the Jewish state that people are dreaming of. They wanted majority Jewish state, and that is what through ethnic cleansing and only through ethnic cleansing they were able to achieve.
Thank you. Carla writes, I bring greetings to Dr. Khalidi from her sister Naomi, who's collaborated with your son. Please speak to the significance of the roots of and the.
That's Carla Wallace. Oh, okay.
Carla Wallace. That
yeah.
one. I can pronounce her last name. Please speak to the significance of the roots of and solidarity between the Black liberation movement, most recently expressed around the murder of George Floyd, and Breonna Taylor and the struggles of a free Palestine.
Yeah. This is something that is getting increasing attention today because, firstly, obviously the struggle of Black people in the United States doesn't have exactly the same roots as the struggle of the Palestinians. But there are some haunting similarities, and those are similarities that people in the Black Lives Matter movement, people in Ferguson, where some of this activism started and developed and took on the form that we know it has today, first came about. I mean, people in Ferguson realized that they were getting bombarded by the police with the same tear gas manufactured in the same factories as Palestinians were being bombarded with. When Palestinian activists got in touch with them and said, listen, what you do with this tear gas, like how you deal with it is you do this, 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 and this. And it was that kind of, sort of grassroots level contact that awakened people, both in Palestine and in Black America, to the similarities for all the differences. There are actually other similarities. One of the great tools that was used in the civil rights movement in the United States was a boycott. And this is a tactic that Palestinian civil society has adopted over the last 10 or so years, the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. And it involves learning from multiple examples of boycott in history. One of the earliest and the best is the Boston Tea Party, a boycott of tea because of the stamp tax that the British colonial government imposed. Another, and the example that gives the name to this activist tool is the Irish boycott of a land agent in Ireland in the 1880s. His name was Captain Boycott. And the boycott of this individual land agent ultimately turned into a tool that the Irish liberation movement used against the British, among many other tools. It was then picked up in South Africa. It was then picked up in India. It was picked up by the civil rights movement. And people were in touch with each other. People in other national movements all over the world fighting colonialism learned from the Irish, learned from the Indians, learned from the South Africans. The Egyptians adopted it in fighting the British colonialism. The Palestinians adopted it in the general strike of 1936. So it has been a tool used by oppressed people against their oppressors. You could argue since the Boston Tea Party, but certainly since the Irish gave it a name 140 or so years ago. And this is an example of something that is now fashionably called intersectionality, which applies also to the understanding between Native Americans and Canadian First Nations and Palestinians of the fact that both of them are operating in a settler colonial reality. Palestinians live within a a reality in Palestine from the river to the sea, which is controlled by Israel, which is fully colonized the territory of the state of Israel inside the Green Line, and is in the process of colonizing, taking over, usurping the land of people in the West Bank and Jerusalem. Most recently, we've seen in Sheikh Jarrah. I'm very heartened when I'm invited to a university, as I was to the College of Staten Island the other day, and as I was to the University of Toronto a few weeks ago, to give a talk. And they started off by recognizing the native peoples on whose land the institution that was sponsoring the talk originally, the native peoples who originally were the owners of that land. So here I'm sitting in the area, as was this College of Staten Island in New York, of the Lenape people and of the Canarsie people. And when you have a statement like that, you have a realization that, well, actually, there are some similarities between that statement that's made at the beginning of the talk and between what the Palestinians are experiencing and have experienced. So I think that from Standing Rock onwards, there's been an understanding among Palestinians and among many Native American activists. And since Ferguson and even before, in fact, the history goes way back. It goes back to the Black Panthers. It goes back to a variety of leaders of Black liberation or Black civil rights struggles who've sympathized with the Palestinians, Malcolm X and others. You've had some who have not. There's a whole swath of leaders of the civil rights movement who were very supportive of Israel. And there were others who understood the situation more or less as I played it out. But I think it's increasingly important today. If you look at the Congressional Black Caucus, if you look at many Black churches, not all, some are very supportive of Israel, but if you look at others, you see that for all the differences, I mean, the situation of Blacks in the United States emerges out of slavery. The situation of the Palestinians emerges out of colonial settler realities. But Jim Crow is very similar to the life of Palestinians. That exclusion from political rights, that exclusion from full personhood is what Blacks experienced in this country right up to the Civil Rights Act, from the destruction of Reconstruction until the Civil Rights Act and the Civil Rights Movement. Well, that's the situation in certain respects of Palestinians. People say apartheid. I say, actually, Jim Crow is a lot better comparison in some respects than is apartheid for all of the similarities. So I think that's a really very important connection.
And I'll just add that the wall murals in Northern Ireland contain images of Dr. King, of Gandhi. So this sense of a solidarity among oppressed people or those who feel victimized by those with power has many interconnections. They don't just go in bilateral directions.
It's no coincidence that the people who suffered the most from English colonialism and English settler colonialism, later British colonialism, are the Irish. They have the longest experience of having their lands usurped, of having their population dispossessed and pushed to the west of the island. They have the longest experience of being ruled over by an ascendancy made up of people of one religious group as against the Catholic majority. They have the experience of partition of their homeland. They know the British and understand the British better than anybody else. And so it's really easy to talk about Palestine in Ireland.
Thank you. Lauren asks, you use the phrase, the country of Palestine several times. Where exactly was the country of Palestine?
Well, it's actually never had legal existence except under the British Mandate. You have a land called Palestine in Arabic geographers and in Arabic travelers and in Arab and Muslim histories for several hundred years. Palestine is the term that's used in Arabic. Sometimes they use another term, al-Ard al-Muqaddasa, the Holy Land. And the understanding of where it is very largely where Palestine is, where we understand what we understand as Palestine or Israel today, i.e. the area between the river and the sea, bounded by something in Lebanon, bounded by the Sinai Desert. That's what was always understood as Palestine in Arabic for hundreds and hundreds of years. Over 1,000 years, 1,500 years. I mean, Muqaddasi, every major geographer talks about Palestine. So the idea of a land of Palestine is there in people's imaginary, if you want. It's not a nation state. People don't see themselves as a Palestinian people any more than people saw themselves as an Israeli people in the year 1800. They saw themselves as a Jewish people. There was a religious understanding of peoplehood. The idea of the Jewish people as having a nation state is a result of nation state nationalism, is a 19th century idea. It's the idea of the Palestinians as a people with a right to national self-determination. It's a modern idea in both cases. But the idea of peoplehood can go back much, much further. In the case of the Jewish people, it obviously goes back much, much further. And the idea of the land of Palestine, the idea of Syria, I mean, the state of Syria is devised in its current frontiers by France and Britain. It's not devised by the Syrian people. Their imaginary of what Syria would have been or was quite different to the nation state boundaries. And that's also true with Palestine. There never was, except under the British mandate, a legal entity called Palestine. There was something called Jund Falastin, which is a province of Arab empires. It was a province, but that's not the same. And I think the question misses the point, which is that in people's minds, this place exists over more than a millennium.
And the book makes a good case, early chapters about connecting how, places that we now think of as nation states, Italy comes to mind, there are others, are fairly modern inventions from.
Absolutely. In fact, they're all modern inventions.
Yeah.
I talked about the 100 Years' War. It's not the French people fighting the English people. It's a bunch of aristocrats, all of whom speak French, fighting for power and one crown against another crown. All fought in France.
Thank you. Perry asks, pardon me, I don't know the history. Why did Stalin and the USSR support the Zionist project? At a critical point, was their support as important as US support for the formation of the State of Israel?
Absolutely. The Partition Resolution would never have been passed without the support of both superpowers. Israel was recognized, immediately was established on May 15th, as soon as the British withdrew and the mandate ended, by both the United States and minutes afterwards by the Soviet Union. Israel won the 1948 war with Soviet, well, they were Czech weapons, but weapons that Stalin had sent, and American weapons. So both superpowers were absolutely crucial at every stage to the creation, the recognition, and the military and diplomatic support for the establishment of Israel. Stalin was as instrumental as Truman. The United States, the Soviet Union was as important as the United States. Now, why? Those are easy facts to check. Why is a harder question, and a lot of historical analysis has gone into trying to determine exactly why Stalin did what he did. And I'll give you what I think is the consensus view. One thing that Stalin certainly saw was that the Middle East was dominated by Britain, and he had an obsession with Britain ever since the Russian Civil War, the civil war between the whites and the reds, immediately after the Bolshevik Revolution and right into the early 1920s, when he was in charge of the southern parts of the Soviet Union, and when his antagonist was various white armies, all of which were armed and supported by the British. So for him, the primary antagonist to the south was always Britain. The primary great power contesting Soviet influence, whether in Turkey or in Iran or in the Arab world, was Britain. And I don't think he fully realized that Britain was a waning power and the United States was the coming power. And in any case, he wanted to get the British out. So that's one reason. Second reason is that Stalin assumed that as he was being told by Zionist leaders, they would be favorable towards the Soviet Union. He thought that Israel would be a country that would be favorable to the Soviet Union. Finally, he saw that many, the main leaders, in fact, of the Zionist movement at that stage, the people who become the leaders of the State of Israel once it's established, were self-described socialists. That certainly was the case with the major parties that dominated the first governments, and in fact, governments right up to the 1970s in the State of Israel. The Labor Party, the Mapam, the Israeli Communist Party, which actually wasn't part of the government. All of these were self-proclaimed socialist parties. And this was a time immediately after the Second World War when the Soviet Union was encouraging, and had been encouraging since the 30s, various popular front policies of alliance between communists and socialists. And so there was a sense that maybe this would become a socialist country. It would not only align itself with the Soviet Union to some extent, it would not only be created in the teeth of British opposition, because, as I didn't have a chance to say, the British had turned against the Zionist movement in 1939 for reasons that had to do with their preparations for World War II. And that's what led the Zionists to move to the United States and the Soviet Union as potential patrons. And so he not only was hoping to get the British out, he was hoping to get an ally, and he was hoping that this would develop into a socialist state. At least that's what most historians think was his motivation.
Marilyn asks if you could address the Camp David Accords and steps they attempted towards peace.
Yeah, the United States has a wonderful reputation, largely undeserved, in my view, as a peacemaker. But it actually was, in certain respects, a peacemaker, insofar as the conflict between the Arab states and Israel was concerned. And the various disengagement agreements that Secretary of State Kissinger negotiated between Egypt and Israel and Syria and Israel in 1973, 74, 75. And then the Camp David Accords of 1978 and the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty of 1979 are all cases where the United States was deeply involved in pushing the Arab countries and Israel towards a peace agreement. Now, they didn't do this because of their love for the brown eyes of the Arab and Jewish peoples, I promise you. They did it in both of those cases, or all of those cases, the disengagement agreements, the Camp David Accords, the peace treaty, and later on supporting peace between Israel and Jordan, essentially for reasons that had to do with the Cold War, with American hegemony in the region, with bringing Arab countries into the American camp and out of the Soviet camp, with ending a conflict which threatened to boil over and create complications that might bring the United States and the Soviet Union into direct confrontation in the Middle East. So there was a wide range of motivations for the United States, in certain circumstances, working assiduously towards defusing the conflict between Israel and the Arab states, and in certain cases, actually helping to negotiate peace treaties between Egypt and between Israel, and later on between Jordan and between Israel. The Jordan-Israeli peace treaty takes place in the context of a process that President George H.W. Bush and Secretary of State Baker start at Madrid, and which continues with negotiations in Washington and the State Department. I took part as an advisor to the Palestinian delegation in one part of those negotiations, the Israeli-Palestinian negotiations. But Jordan and Israel were negotiating under American auspices in the same building in the State Department in Washington in 1991, 92, 93, and that ultimately resulted in the Jordanian-Israeli peace treaty of 1994. So in that respect, the United States was operating, including at Camp David, to bring about peace. It did not do that with regard to Palestine, however. None of the kind of major strategic interests, the Cold War, ending a conflict that might become exacerbated and lead to an American-Soviet confrontation, were present. There just wasn't the same interest, strategic interest. And the United States, in fact, has, in my view, obstructed the achievement of peace between Palestinians and Israelis. I have a book about this called Brokers of Deceit, if anybody wants to go into the details of it. And in fact, what then Israeli Prime Minister Begin does at Camp David is to make concessions to Egypt in return for a separate peace with Egypt, but obtains in return American and Egyptian acquiescence to giving him a free hand with what was most important to him, which was what he called Judea and Samaria, the occupied territories. And that's what the Camp David Accords enshrine, and that later on is incorporated into the peace treaty, and that later on becomes the basis of the negotiations at Madrid, at Washington, and ultimately in Oslo. I argue that Begin's vision, as we see it in the Camp David Accords, and in fact, it's a student of mine who wrote a wonderful book on this subject, who lays it out the most clearly, a student by the name of Seth Anziska. I think his book is called Preventing Palestine, published a couple of years ago, lays this out in great detail.
I'll just add editorially for our listeners that the conclusion of the book not only lays out these principles about equality, justice, it rings very familiar to American ears in terms of principles that we think that we embrace, and is a very lovely framework to read about what must be created for justice to occur. It is not as fraught with historical detail as many of the other parts of the book, based on Dr. Khalid's deep understanding of the history. Maz asks, please address Amy Kaplan's work and her views on American and Israel's shared sense of exceptionalism.
Yeah, I think this is actually the late Amy Kaplan's book, Our American Israel, is, I think, one of the most important books for anybody who wants to understand the relationship between Israel and the United States. In fact, it's one of the most important books written on Palestine and Israel, even though it's mainly about the United States. Amy Kaplan, who died, unfortunately, recently, used to teach at the University of Pennsylvania. And she was an American historian and a cultural historian. And she lays out the basis for this very unusual, this exceptional relationship. And as the questioner suggests, one of the things she shows is a shared sense. One of the things she shows is a basis for this unusual relationship, is a shared sense of exceptionalism. But she shows there are many other bases. It's an absolutely brilliant book. I can't commend it highly enough. And it's a tragedy that she died as young as she did, just after completing this book. In fact, there was a book talk. She was in the last stages of terminal cancer when we had a book party for her at Penn.
Chuck asks, given the current settlements in the West Bank, what sort of political structure could you envision that might be acceptable to both parties?
Yeah, well, if you take those settlements as a given, as an unchangeable given, which Israeli politicians do, and which the Trump administration did, and which many other American politicians and policymakers do, then I think you have to jettison the idea of a two-state solution. Because those settlements are established not just in implementation of the vision of the greater land of Israel philosophy, which many Israeli leaders share. They were created with the very specific objective of making impossible the creation of a Palestinian state. They are sited and located strategically in a way to break up the continuity of Arab populations in the occupied territories or neighborhoods in occupied Arab East Jerusalem. So if you take those as a given, then you have to throw the idea of a two-state solution along the lines that at least it's been understood completely out the window. And it's a little bit like the emperor has no clothes. I mean, if you say two-state solution, then what are you going to do to unwind 54 years of assiduous work in order to make that solution impossible by Israeli government after Israeli government? I mean, they've been pouring concrete since soon after the '67 war, ceaselessly. You now have somewhere in the realm of 600 or 700,000 Israeli citizens living in the occupied territories. That's a humongous proportion of the Jewish population of Israel. These are voters, these are citizens. You're going to remove them from the occupied, and how do you propose to do that? What Israeli politician calls for that? And if you don't do that, that which was done in order to make a Palestinian state impossible, how are you still talking about a two-state solution? I think people are essentially talking out of two sides of their mouths, and they're either lying to others or they're lying to themselves if they don't address how to deal with that. And at the same time, they keep babbling on about a two-state solution. So I'm not suggesting that a two-state solution is impossible. Tony Judd, the late Tony Judd, once said, what any politician has done, another politician can undo. And we're seeing abortion rights undone, and we're seeing all kinds of laws. Our gun laws in New York State are about to be undone by the Supreme Court, it looks like. But so what one politician has done, another politician can undo, or another Supreme Court decision can undo. But I don't see how that is going to happen in this case. Now, things could change. If you maintain those settlements and you insist that they have to stay, or you say it's politically inconceivable for them to be removed, then you're talking about a situation in which Israel has effectively annexed the entirety of what used to be mandatory Palestine. And you have one Israel from the river to the sea. that is the reality, actually. De facto, that is the situation. There's one legal authority, there's one security, one party responsible for security, there's one sovereign authority in the entire land of Israel, Palestine, in the entirety of the country between the river and the sea. People live under different legal regimes. All Israelis live under Israeli law. Arab and Jewish Israeli citizens of the state of Israel live under Israeli law. The others live under a patchwork of laws. Some of it is mandatory laws, some of it is British emergency regulations that Israel has repurposed, some of it is Jordanian law, some of it is old Ottoman law. But all of them are under the security control of the state of Israel. You enter, you leave, you import, you export with the permission of Israel and under the oversight and supervision of Israel, the entire territory between the river and the sea. We have a one-state situation right now. That state is the state of Israel. And the question is, how do you transform that into something better and different for everybody, where one people is not enjoying rights at the expense of another people, where one people doesn't have security at the expense of the insecurity of another group, and so on and so forth. That's what has to be changed. How you do that, one state, two states, cantons, multiple states, I don't know.
We're nearing the end of our time, and there are many topics we couldn't get to, but as the founder of a Peace Studies program, I have to ask you to say briefly about the successes of the first Intifada from 86 to 93.
87.
87, thank you, which largely relied and succeeded using nonviolent means as opposed to the second Intifada. And the book is quite clear about the positive effects that had on the perception of Palestinians internationally. And so could you just leave us with a sense of how that strategic tactic worked successfully a couple decades ago?
Well, I described the first Intifada, which was essentially unarmed. It wasn't entirely nonviolent. It was mainly nonviolent. Strikes, demonstrations, boycotts, mass events, grassroots organizing. I described the first Intifada as a notable victory for the Palestinians. I think the fruits of that victory were thrown away at Camp David by the PLO. But I think it's one of the few unequivocal victories in Palestinian history, even though, as I said, it did not result in what it might have. It changed Israeli consciousness. It really changed the way people thought. It changed the way Rabin thought. He was Minister of Defense. He tried to use force to suppress it, and he realized that wouldn't work later on. I wish I had a chance to talk about how far he went and how things he didn't reach, he and other Israeli leaders at the time. And I lay out in the book the understanding of someone who was actually a friend of mine, and I think was one of the most profound thinkers on Palestine, a man named Iqbal Ahmed, who argued that for all of his acceptance of the idea of armed struggle, he had been involved with the FLN in Algeria. He had worked with Frantz Fanon. He believed that in certain circumstances, force was legitimate. That was not the appropriate tactic for the Palestinians, for reasons that I lay out, which he laid out and I lay out in the book, and you can look up his writings and see why he said what he said. And I actually think that that's probably the best approach for the Palestinians, for a variety of reasons. If you're interested in why, read the book.
I will end by telling our audience, I know we wish that we could sound off to express our appreciation and how much we learned this evening from an expert at lecturing. I think he's delivered a few before in his life. The link to the video of this, which will be available, will be sent out in a few days to everyone who registered. And I'd just like to end with the dedication of the book, which I recommend to everyone, in which Dr. Khalidi says, I dedicate this book to my grandchildren, Tariq, Idris, and Noor, all born in the 21st century, who we will hopefully see the end of this 100 years war. From your mouth to God's ears. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Thanks to everybody who listened in.
There are many more questions here. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them.
Maybe another session next year.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye now.